Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? All right, good. This reminds me very often when I do training, 4-day training, and we're reaching the end, and I know that people don't have much energy, and so I very much feel sorry for you having to have me at the end. I probably wouldn't want myself, and I'm sure the only reason you're sticking around because we have something to drink afterwards. But I'll try to make it as entertaining as possible. Okay. Oops. Nope. Nope. Oh. So it's not me? Nope. Hey, it worked. And so now you have the advantage of actually going ahead and seeing what I look like 10 kilos lighter. In any case, a little bit of background information to me. As you can guess, I'm from Austria, but I do not speak as an Austrian, right? I actually, from Los Angeles, been living in Vienna for the last 27 years. Decided I had enough working for somebody else, and so I decided to form my own company about 4 years ago. This is what we'll be talking about today. And another disadvantage of being the last one is that virtually everybody else talked about something that you had in your presentation. So it's a bit of a challenge, right? And so what I'll try to do is synthesize that of what we've heard throughout the entire day and incorporate that into what I'll be showing you. Let's see if this works. Oh, hey, got it without testing it. You know, I teach, I've been a business analyst practitioner for a number of years, and I've been teaching for at least the last 4. And one of the difficulties that a number of the students have that I've been teaching, oops, hello, that's good. But something's happening over there, and it's not me. I don't know what it is. Somebody's playing tricks, okay? One of the difficulties that a lot of the students have is that if they look at a document like the business analysis body of thank you, knowledge, I could tell I'm brain dead, or anything similar, is that it's very theoretical and people have difficulties getting their arms around it. And furthermore, these types of models are not very linear. And so people are not necessarily always looking for a how-to possibility. But for the most part, the idea is to make something a little bit simpler, something that people can understand a little bit better. And so I've had this idea going through my head for a number of years, and it took me about 2 years to actually come up with this model. Let me go ahead and explain to you what you're looking at. I called it, I tried to take the various components that we have within business analysis, at least in the beginning, and identify what are the prerequisites. What do I need to actually move forward? And some of this is quite clear. We need to know exactly which problem we're trying to solve before we know that we've solved it. And Vladimir talked about this one earlier in his hypothesis-driven development. We need to understand the current state and the future state before we can identify the initial scope. And that was something that Irina talked about. We talk about stakeholders, and I'll go ahead and give you an example of persona analysis, and that was something that Elena talked about. We'll go ahead and come up with something unique concerning elicitation. We move on to solutions, and there's always at least 2 solutions. Why? Anybody have an idea why there's at least 2 solutions? Do nothing is always a solution, right? And so we'll take a look at a model that allows us to better understand the viability of our solutions. And then lastly, the selection. Which one is the best solution? And that was something that Valentin talked about in his presentation. I'd like to go ahead and highlight something different. And so the idea is to stay within the realm of what we've been covering so far and add something a little bit more to the mix. Okay, without further ado, let's see if that works. Very good. So first of all, we start with understanding the problem or the opportunity. And a word of warning, the content that I cover within my presentation is very non-IT. And I do this for a reason. I'm going to make an assumption that most of you are IT people. And if I go ahead and talk about IT things, is it probably something you've already heard before? What's the objective of talking about something you already know about? How about talking about something new? And so I decided to take that approach. Actually, Elena talked talked about the customer journey, but I'd like to talk about something very specific. This is the buyer's customer journey. Your customers, I'm making an assumption that most of you are dealing with the outsourcing world. Your customers have customers themselves. What kind of thoughts are going through their head? Let's go ahead and take a look at this journey, and let me go ahead and describe the various stops along the ways. The first one would be discovery. So how did they find you? What was their initial impression of you? Did they feel that you were actually speaking to them? If not, what happens? They drop it, right? So it's extremely important to make sure that people feel that they're being spoken to right from the get-go. Let's move on to the awareness. So they found you, and they feel that you're actually speaking to them. And so the idea is, so what is their feeling? What's their first contact with a human being? Because usually this will be taking place on a website. So they're talking to an individual. How did that go? Do they still feel that they're being spoken to? Then we continue with the conversation. This is truly the business analysis part, because we're talking about different personas. You know what? There's a big problem within IT. IT doesn't know how to deal with non-IT personas. Not at all. Why? Why do you think that IT has difficulty in dealing with non-IT personas? You have difficulty relating to them. And the problem is that if you can't understand your customer, how do you know that you're actually covering their needs? Could be a bit of a problem, huh? Okay, so how does that interaction look like? Do you recognize who that persona is? Are you able to actually understand their needs? Are you able to come up with solutions that meet those needs? Those are all clearly prerequisites for actually going ahead and closing the purchase, right? You make an offer, either it appears to cover their needs or not, and then you close the deal. Are you done? No. So you sold something, hooray! Now you have to implement it. So you promise something, right? You promise something to your customers. Can you actually deliver on the promise? I have the sneaky feeling that this probably rings a bell with a lot of the projects that you have today, right? Okay, so now we're talking about activation. And I know that you usually don't see this part, but what takes place after the activation? Do you think that persona forgot what their needs were? Nope. Do you think they're testing you the entire time, whether you're actually delivering on that of what you promised here? This is a clear promise. How do they actually go ahead and pass on the message to their friends about your business? Do you see a relationship between this and what you're doing today? If not, I suggest you start. Okay? Let's go ahead and move on. Oops, slip. So that's great. You've gone ahead and identified the problem, and I think within that customer journey, there could be numerous touch points where that problem could actually appear. So Irina talked about this one earlier. It's about understanding the current state, where are you today, and the future state, or the desired outcomes that you expect at the end. So now I'd like to go ahead and talk about a different model of how we actually go ahead and understand what that current state actually looks like. And again, I wanted to come up with examples that were non-IT, with a chance that perhaps you haven't seen this so far. This one's called Porter's Five Forces. It comes from a gentleman by the name of Michael Porter, who's a professor at Harvard. Developed this model in 1980. And for me, this model still applies today as much as it did when it was originally created. Let me explain to you what we're actually looking at. This is the part that we usually concentrate on, industry competitors. So it's the industry, understanding who your competitors are. It's basically where you use your benchmark for the most part. And for most companies, this is where it ends. And that's where the problems begin. Because we have a number of different factors that play a very important role. Let's go ahead and start from the left to the right and then top to bottom. The suppliers. It's very important to understand who your suppliers are, right? Is it possible that your suppliers could actually be your competition? Your thoughts? I worked in a business that was clearly the case. And it wasn't always called coopetition either. All of a sudden, the suppliers understand, oh, there's a possibility to actually go ahead and cut these people out of the equation. What's disintermediation? Isn't that what we're talking about here? Do the buyers or the customers have a choice? Always, and we should never forget that. As soon as we think that they have no other options, they'll show us otherwise. Now let's go ahead and look at the other two components to be found within this model. Starting at the top, potential entrants. And this is probably one of the most interesting ones, simply because we keep thinking there is nobody else who's going to actually go ahead and encroach on our customers. But of course, we know plenty of examples of where that went different. Just say Apple, probably one of the best examples. What's the advantage that a potential entrant has that you don't? Any ideas? These mental models that we have in thinking this is the only way we can do business, right? And potential entrants doesn't know any better, so they're free. They could do it any way they want. And then, of course, substitutes. We keep forgetting that our clients always have a choice. And one of the options for substitute is choosing nothing at all, right? So I believe a model like Porter's 5 Forces allows us to actually go ahead and look at the current state from a different perspective. Okay? Let's move on. So we've gone ahead and defined the current state. We understand the future state. So for me, that means that we actually know what our initial scope is. Does that stay the same? Never. This is constantly being in flux because we get more information all the time, right? And so the more information we get, the clearer this becomes. But we need to start somewhere, right? Okay, so we've gone ahead and identified our scope, which is a prerequisite to knowing who our stakeholders are. Why? Well, if we don't know what our scope is, how do we know who's going to be affected? A typical definition of a stakeholder is somebody who's positively or negatively affected by our assignment at hand. And so we need to know what the assignment is before knowing who our stakeholders are, right? One of the biggest problems we have, apart from the fact that stakeholder management for the most part is done very poorly anywhere I look, is that we treat our stakeholders as numbers. What do you think I'm talking about here? Treating the stakeholders as numbers. They're listed in some form. We send them a request. They either fill it out or they don't fill it out. But we forget that we're actually talking about human beings. And perhaps some of the needs that our stakeholders have are not necessarily to be found within functional specifications. So let's see if we can better understand who we're talking about. And I thought, for this example, it might be good to talk about a persona group that I suspect that you're dealing with quite often. And that would be your customer, the person who's actually giving you the assignment. So let's go through this exercise and let's see if this matches how you actually see this persona. So what's this individual thinking? Oh, are they actually going to deliver? I better watch them closely, because I think if I don't give them clear instructions, they're not going to know what to do, and I won't get what I need. I have a lot of pressure to keep down the cost. And if I had a better option, or I could have somebody delivering as close to me, I'd probably choose that one. What do you think? Do you think that's what these personas are actually thinking? Seeing refers to influencers. Who are they actually being influenced by? In this particular case, I believe this individual is being influenced by their own customers, what their own customers are actually looking for. Do you think this person has a boss? Tend to think yes. Depending upon the actual business, very possibly they'd be influenced by the government. Does that play a role for this persona? Clearly. We don't think about this one enough, I believe. So let's move on to the next one. Feel. What do you think this individual's feeling? I never have enough time to get everything done. Sometimes it's too much. Be nice if I can get home on time. Do you find that in functional specifications? I haven't. Are those needs from this persona? I would say yes. Okay, so what does this individual do? That person micromanages you, or figures out a way to blame you any way, shape, or form. Do you think that fits the description of that persona? Let's move on. So we talked about their needs, but how do we actually go ahead and classify our requirements? Are all requirements the same? Of course not. Do we know what we're trying to achieve with our requirements? Very often we make assumptions, and we might be right, or maybe we're not. So let's go ahead and take a look at this model. This is called the Kano model. This is coming from Noriaki Kano, and the idea is that we can come up with a model to actually go ahead and classify our requirements. So let me go ahead and describe what you're looking at here. We go from non-fulfillment to fulfillment. We go from dissatisfaction to fulfillment, and we move to satisfaction within this range. So let's go ahead and take a look at these three categories: basics, performance, and delighters. One of the biggest problems we have with regards to requirements is that we assume that the client or the individual, the stakeholder, tells us everything that they need. But I think within this category, it's very difficult to get this information. Let me describe basics for you. Basics are the absolute minimum that a stakeholder is expecting from your product or service. And if you don't reach the basics, they have no interest in your product. And there's a clear danger here, folks, because they think, of course, surely everybody knows that these are the basics for my requirements. Where's the danger? They will assume that you know, and they won't bother to tell you. So let's follow that scenario a little bit more. They assume that you know, so they don't bother to tell you. So will that end up in functional specifications? No. They don't think about it. It's part of their day-to-day activities, right? So what happens if you don't meet the basics? You deliver a product or a service, and they come back and said, this is useless. So how do we actually go ahead and capture this data? Let's go on to the next one. Performance. This is a very interesting one because when I talk to numerous corporations, they think that this category, performance, are delighters, but actually is only an enhancement of something they already have. They're not really being inventive. And there's some clear dangers tied to just going ahead and working on performance. So you go ahead and come up with something new, your competition matches what you've actually gone ahead and delivered, and then where does the battle go? Then it becomes a commodity. And it's all about price. Whereas with the delighters, it's a little bit, sorry. With the delighters, it's a little bit different. A delighter is something that your stakeholders didn't even know it was possible. So do you think you can actually come up with delighters? Do you think delighters show up in functional specifications? I don't think so. The problem is we keep asking our clients to tell us exactly what their actual requirements are, and we never ask them what their needs are. We keep expecting them to give us information that they cannot give us. Why? They don't have the same knowledge that you do, but we keep expecting them to have it. I use this model quite often in talking to corporations in trying to build the case for agile. Because when we talk about delighters, we're talking about a special type of requirement. It's called a latent requirement. And you will not find this very often listed. A latent requirement is something that people didn't even know they needed until they saw it. And I'm sure you could probably think of a number of examples of products and services that actually fall into that category. And so if we only concentrate on the needs and we let the specialists actually go ahead and come up with the solutions, what are the chances of the client coming back and said, "You mean that's possible?" Why would they say that? Because in their mental model, they never thought that something like that was possible. And of course, they would never ask for it if they didn't think it was possible, right? So usually when I show that one to marketing, talking about agile, I could see them salivating. They really like that one. Okay. So let's go through the path. We understand what the problem is or the opportunity. We've defined the as-is or current state or future state, which gives us our initial scope, right? We need the scope to understand who our stakeholders are. And we need to know who our stakeholders are before we can start collecting the requirements. So what's left? Obviously, we need to know what the needs are before we can actually go ahead and start looking at solutions. And we have already clarified there's always more than just one solution, there's at least two. So now I'd like to go ahead and take a look at a model that some of you might be familiar with. Can I have a quick show of hands, a question that hasn't been posed, unless it was posed in Russian and I didn't catch it? How many of you are involved in startups? Are you familiar with this model? It's called the business model canvas. Came actually from an Austrian, Alex Osterwalder. And the idea is that we can very quickly ascertain whether our business model is sound or not. So let me go through the various fields and describe what we're looking at. So this is obviously where we start. Value proposition. If you have nothing to offer, then you have no product or service. Agreed? We move from the left-hand side, which are basically our cost, to the right-hand side, which is our revenue. And you could see below we have our cost structure, and we have our revenue streams. Let's go through the initial points going from left to right. First, we have our key partners. Regardless of whatever our situation is, we might have actual partners with our business. They could be suppliers. Can we identify them? If not, could be a problem. Do we know what our activities are? What we're actually doing, right? And do we understand our resources? This is just for starters. Let's move on to the right. Our customer relationships. Do we understand what our customer relationships actually look like? If not, then how can we measure they're effective or not? Do we understand how we're actually getting our product to the market? And do we understand our customer segments? Can we identify our customers? For example, VIP, often used, I'm just taking your list. And if we can identify our cost and our revenue streams, is there much of a business plan? The great part about a business model canvas is that you can come up with something very quickly. You don't spend more time doing something that brings you nothing. Okay, then let me get to the last point, and that is, so we've come up with a list of all kinds of solutions, and we have our short list of our solutions, but how do we know which solution is the best? I'd like to go ahead and highlight a method that I found a couple years ago that I think is very, very powerful. Going under the adage, if you do not meet the criteria to make a good decision, what is the chance that the decision will be sound? 0. So can we actually go ahead and define that? What do we need to make the correct decision? And so I found this model. It's called decision quality. And I'd like to talk to you about the various components that you see on the screen. Let's start with the first one, setting the right frame. Do we all have the same agreement of what this decision's about? If not, how do we know that we're making the right decision? Very often, it begins and ends with the actual definition. Have we considered alternatives, or do we believe by nature this solution has to be the best? Then actually you made your decision before you actually went ahead and started the process to begin with, right? I believe that Valentine was talking about this one, gathering meaningful data. So what do we consider meaningful data to be? My definition is data that helps us to go ahead and make sure that the correct decision is being made. Can we have this validated? Sure. And that needs to be part of our process, right? Clarifying values and trade-offs. Now, I don't know how often you've been in this situation, but if you've ever had to talk to people within corporations, you'll realize that you will never be able to come up with one solution that will make everybody happy. So where does that leave you? Basically, you need to make sure that you're able to go ahead and perform some sort of trade-offs, because at the end, you need the commitment of everyone to move forward. This is the second one that I think Valentine was talking about, using logical reasoning to ensure that we know what we're trying to decide, our logic is sound, and we feel comfortable with the actual decision we're making. Now, does this have to be a long, laborious process? No. We can get a group together. For those of you who are familiar with planning poker and the like, can't we go ahead and get a diverse group together and just ask for their opinion? So, do we have a common understanding? Have we looked at all kinds of alternatives? Are there other solutions we haven't thought about? What about the data? Do we feel that the data is actually sound? Can we go ahead and test it? Do we feel that when it comes down to the decision that we can make those trade-offs? Do we agree on that this logic is sound? And then I've saved the best for last. Do we feel that the executives, once they've made that decision, will actually hold to it? And usually you'll go ahead and follow this up with some sort of business case to close the actual dealings. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a recap of what we looked at. We started with the problem or the opportunity. And I need to tell you a story. Inevitably, when I get assignments, and I suspect that you'll understand this one, we're posed with a solution. I say, this is the solution that the client actually wants. Very often today, I ask them before I continue with the process, so which problem should it solve? And that becomes a very difficult ordeal for the clients because they've never really thought of it before. Most people feel they don't have enough time to actually go ahead and look at the problem. But obviously, they have enough time to go ahead and deal with rework, right? So the real key is being able to understand the root cause of the problem. Then we move on to understanding, if we understand the problem, what is our current state or our as is? That's another one that companies have a lot of fun with. Very often I'm told, we have no documentation. I know that never happens to you, right? And then we go ahead and move on. I got a laugh. How about that? That's pretty good at 1700 after a full day. Then we get to the desired state, what they're actually looking for. So what's the difference between an outcome and a deliverable? Because, you know, when we're already at the solution, we're talking about deliverables. Here's my definition. I'd be keen on your feedback. An outcome is the benefits that a customer expects at the end. The deliverable is how you match it. The problem is very often we confuse the two, and we think by coming up with the deliverables, we've matched the outcome. And we find out way too late that we didn't. As I mentioned, we need to know what our scope is before we can move on to the stakeholders to find out who our stakeholders are. We need to know who our stakeholders are before we could start with elicitation. We have to understand the needs before we can go on to the solution. And we need to understand all possible solutions before we can actually figure out what the best one is. So when we start a process like this, are we ever finished? What do you think? Certain activities, is it possible to go back and say, oops, we thought we understood the problem, but actually we don't? Is that possible? All the time. What about scope? Do you think that possibly you might be in an assignment and the scope might change? I know that never happens either, does it? Right? Looks like I'm doing better with the laughs. Okay. Is it possible you're in the middle of an assignment and you realize there's a new stakeholder group? Like all the time, right? You're in the middle of an assignment and you realize you don't have all the requirements, right? Is it possible in the middle of an assignment that you could realize you have the wrong solution? Unfortunately, yes. If some of these parts were done faulty, very possibly you get to the end and you find out that the solution doesn't cover anything that your customers actually want. And then, of course, for me, this was always the missing part of any of the frameworks that I've run across, is making sure that the selection process is sound. Because if you don't, then how is your project supposed to run quickly and efficiently? This part is the justification why we move on to actually go ahead and start our projects. So if this part is wrong, what's the chance the project's going to run smoothly? Not very good, right? Okay. Right, then thank you very much. And if you have any questions. And thank you very much for not walking out on me. I know how difficult it is at the end.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
Ребят, перед тем, как мы начнем задавать вопросы, я хочу напомнить, что у нас сейчас будет лотерея, сразу после этих вопросов. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
If you have questions, raise your hand, or even shout because I don't see them.
Yeah, there's one back there. Oh, there's, okay.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a very wide question. This question is about when you have no access to final customer and you're talking with management that have no idea what they needs, what the customer needs. How can you manage this?
Well, first of all, maybe I'm in a luxurious position that in the assignments that I have, I'm always talking to somebody who can answer these questions for me. And I hold them accountable as well. So let's go ahead and follow this one up. Let's assume that you're not in that situation. Can you be held accountable for that? Actually, you shouldn't. Who would be held accountable? Wouldn't that be the person who is that you're working for? Isn't that an opportunity to actually go ahead and escalate it? What happens if they do nothing? Isn't it their problem then? Not yours? If not, then why not? Questions to think about. I know it's not easy, but I think the real problem is if we don't come up with transparency, let's go back to if we don't come up with transparency, then how is this supposed to work? It's a recipe for disaster, right? So let's make sure we do it right from the beginning. Yep.
Thank you. Do you follow something like a design thinking methodology, or just some sort of an ideation session, where you get together with different stakeholders and just create solutions, or do you mostly do it, with a designer or somebody like that, and then present to a stakeholder? How do you do that usually?
Usually, when we're talking about a designer, that means that we've already defined that the solutions could be automation. And so very possibly, let me go ahead and mention something that you heard already from me today at lunch, that when I look at this part, when most customers come to me throughout my entire career, which are too many years to actually go ahead and announce in public, that I would say about 60% are process problems. So let's go to the automation. If we're talking about a designer, we're talking about automation. Isn't that way too late? So the idea is, first of all, understanding the right problem. Let's make the assumption that we understand the problem and the solution is tied to automation, okay, just for simplicity's sake. The approach that I like taking is very low-key and getting a diverse group together and say, think out of the box. What possible solutions could we actually go ahead and come up with? It's crazier the better. And so I would perform some sort of brainstorming to make sure that we've covered all possible components. Making a differentiation, this is the real problem that companies have. When you ask them, there are 3 different categories we have: possible, feasible, and practical. And just like everyone going to the solutions, everybody loves going to the practical. But that doesn't mean it's the best solution, right? So how do we create an environment that we are understanding all possible solutions with the intention, once you've gone ahead and collected all possible solutions, how do we understand what's viable here? So going from out to in, which I think is probably, to give you a more direct answer, is the former and not the latter. Am I right with that assumption? Sorry, I used the word assumption again, yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Thanks for your speech. One question. Have you been inspired by business analysis core concept model? Because there are some similar between these 2 model, ecosystem and BAS model.
It's not possible because I've heard of it for the first time right now.
Okay, and how about the context as one of the cornerstone in business analysis? Yep. What do you think? Should we include the context of solution, context of problem, opportunity in this model?
I'm thinking much simpler than that. If I was thinking in that direction, I would stay with the body of knowledge. I was trying to cover a clear need that I'm confronted with constantly, is that people can't get their arms around this idea of business analysis. And so, you know how people are, right? If you gave them a how-to manual, they would be happy. The fact is, we have difficulties within this realm called business analysis to come up with a how-to model. So, can I create something that's somewhat linear, that at least can be used as a checklist? And the real key here, folks, is that even if you're not involved in all of these activities, can you at least make sure that they were completed in some fashion? And maybe that might be back to your question originally. Can you go back and say, so which problem is this solving? Do we understand the current state? So at least you can perform some sort of diagnostics before you actually get started with your work. And I think it's your right to ask these questions. And if they push back, then you really have to wonder, what's the chance of having a success with the project? Because I think that's really the problem. You're given a solution, and you have no idea if it's solving any problems. And then they blame you for not solving the problems. And that's really the issue, right? That's the root cause of your problem. I don't know if I answered your question properly. Because the context, I look at this as something being much simpler. The goal is to come up with the simple model that everybody can understand there's a dependency between all these concepts, understand this is not something you do once. In my mind, this needs to be completed before every project, because if you don't, the chances of you having a success in your project are not very high. Input, transformation, output. And if we have bad input here, what's the chances of us having good output? Also 0. Sorry, there was somebody else asked a question in the back. Yeah?
Thank you for your speech. And you mentioned earlier that a stakeholder is a person who is positively or negatively impacted by the change, right?
By your assignment, yes, correct.
So what if this person will be dismissed or fired because of the new system?
They're stakeholders, yes.
How we should deal with them? Should we communicate to them something? Or just say, excuse me, but you will be fired because of my system?
No. Yeah, that's not an easy one. And really, we're talking about the transformation part, right? What's the real problem here? The real problem is the company who gave you that assignment, or sorry, can I just, for simplicity's sake, just assume that you're developing something for a third party or for a customer, and this is going to be one of the end results, right? Okay. So what's the real problem here? The real problem is that this employer is not very transparent with the workforce, right? Are you the project manager? Because the project manager should be responsible for the transformation. Do you have a say in what those deliverables are? Because part of that solution has to be that there's an equitable closure to those people that will be laid off, right? And I'm assuming you want something from those people that will be laid off. I mean, I run across this one quite often. Oh, the persona analysis is real easy for that one. Let's go back. No, you can't, but of course. But we know what they're thinking. It's a matter of time, isn't it? Until they're doing this project so they can get rid of me. That's what they're thinking, right? So who are they being influenced by? Are they? I think they're being influenced by their fellow employees. They're being influenced by the managers who are not being very transparent with them. Who else do you think they're probably the media? Everybody's getting laid off. If you reach a certain age, even more. What are they feeling? I think we both know what that is, right? And what are they doing? They're going to try to avoid giving you any information because they think that will prolong their job, correct? So what do? Don't you need to make sure that this person actually you have to bring them some sort of security, because otherwise you're not going to get your requirements. Or you pass it on to somebody else and say, this is not possible to come up with the requirements in this situation. And yeah, but I mean, that's foolhardy. Shouldn't they have thought of that beforehand? So what's the real problem? Poor project management and poor stakeholder management, because they knew that these people were stakeholders too, right? Okay. Yeah, sorry. That was it? Easy question.
This is the last one.
Could you provide further examples of the ecosystems you are working with?
I'm sorry, the last part?
Could you provide the examples of ecosystems you are working with?
Any systems that I'm working with?
The examples of the ecosystem. On
Oh,
the
of
slide
how
you
it's
had the
appli- how it's
business
applied, you
analysis
mean?
Ecosystem, yeah.
I think that's actually a little bit of a longer question. Because, let's go back, sorry. I'll apply it to an assignment that I'll get. For example, there's one that I have. It's coming from a large software provider, global software provider, who wants to create an e-learning platform to manage sales with their partners. So that was the request. So we're already told in which direction the solution should go. So where do I start? Understanding what is the real problem. The real problem is that one of their competition is having them for lunch, and they need to do something quickly. So that's motivation number one. Motivation number two, they have difficulty in selling. So they need to come up with a better model to actually go ahead and sell. So now I'm getting closer to the real motivations, right? Now I move on. So the current state, they have nothing or virtually nothing. So we're going through a definition of what that optimal state is, or at least the desired state. And the desired state will take on different forms because we can't just make the great leap. I prefer to take an iterative approach and try a proof of concept and put something out there. The stakeholders at this point is the company who's hired us plus the partners. We're doing one proof of concept, so it's one partner. The elicitation is actually looking at using document management, looking at the existing content from the provider, looking at existing content from the client, looking at best practices using benchmarking, understanding what is best in class with e-learning within this environment. Do we understand what their competition's offering? Can we come up with a unique selling proposition? The solutions I'm not that far, to be honest, but the solutions are probably going to be taking on different approaches depending upon the level of involvement from our side. It's clear that we're looking for a proof of concept. And so I'll put together a business case, give this to the client, and they should make a selection. That help? Yeah, okay. And if you want any more examples, I think we'll take that during the after hours, okay? All right, thank you.